So probably the first thing to do would be to give a brief, like, synopsis or teaser, if you will.
Right. Of US6. I think ultimately the novel is about the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below. And so US6, the title has a few meanings. It means US Route 6, which is a highway that cuts across the heart of America. It also means, it refers to the US6 protein, which is a membrane protein, and its functions parallel the plot line of the book. And it ultimately, at the end, means us six, the six of us, and it refers to the six fictional authors of the Hexalogy. Each book is written by a different character, and so that's why it's split up into books.
Could you elaborate on how the similarities and the functions of the protein in the book, where they correspond?
Well, that's actually one of the most recent discoveries with the book, is the US6 protein. And so I actually spoke with a geneticist about what is the function of this protein, what does it do? And it's a membrane protein that I had her explain it to me in a plot line, and she said the best way to describe it would be, it's like an FBI agent that is hiding a most wanted poster from its team. So it's similar to, say, the plot of The Departed, where there's an inside agent. So because it's a membrane protein also, it's kind of a convoy sentinel. It allows in and out certain viruses. And that's kind of the function of the US6 highway. In the book, in later years, it is a way for transports to take troops and machinery across the country. And the protagonist in the book is a convoy sentinel. So just like the protein, he decides who passes and who doesn't. So there's a lot of correlation there. There's a lot of as above, so below. And that is actually a recent piece of magic I found with the book, this protein and its connection. And that's really probably the most interesting thing about this whole process for me is some of this magic that happened afterwards. After writing it, I found connections, personal connections that I could not have planned as an author. And so there's just a whole series of those. I might even come out with a second book that outlines some of these inadvertent magics that occurred.
And what was the writing process like for these first three books?
Well, I used actually the origin of the whole project was a father-son short film project I did with my son Cayman. In that he was in his teen years, and I wanted to find a way for us to work on something together. And we came up with this idea for a short film we called The Unveiling. And when we'd do our little family trips, weekend trips away, we'd bring the camera and we'd do different scenes and kind of film it on the fly and then put it together. And it was a great way for us to connect on something creative. And that became the short film, The Unveiling. And when that project was over, I was still into it and kept filming a sequel. That footage was on an external drive that eventually died. And while waiting to get it resurrected, I started writing out the story, which I really enjoyed. So I just kept writing, and that external drive has yet to be resurrected. But so that's how it started, and I wrote it into a book. And actually, the Unveiling, the film, has a place in the book, in that the protagonist the film has become, in the book, it has become some Hollywood creation that kind of stole the story from the protagonist. So the protagonist laments the unveiling in the book. So I was able to kind of deconstruct the film in that first book. But what I used was an autobiographical fiction method, in that I took places and settings and even dates in my own life and extrapolated those out into more intriguing storylines. And I found it actually very therapeutic. You could actually rewrite memories or make mundane moments into very profound scenarios and plot points. And I think that really was, again, therapeutic, but where some of the magic came from in this process for me personally. So I find myself talking about the process more than the story anymore, because I think there's a lot of benefit to people doing this. Taking their own life and extrapolating certain memories into a storyline, and you'll find a lot of revelations in that. At least I did. So,
what was one of the biggest ones for you? Without, I guess, giving away too much of your...
Yeah. Well, my early life was as an army brat, taken from base to base, 6 different cities by the time I was in 3rd grade, and so I was able to make the protagonist go through those same movements, but his story is he's being moved around to these army bases for a reason. He's part of the process. It's not just my father being stationed at different places. This protagonist has a purpose for going to these different bases. So I was able to pull memories from these different places and to turn them into the storyline, extrapolate and accentuate certain memories into broader themes.
What's one of those magic connections you've discovered since the book's been out and released?
Well, there's a series of connections that were made that I couldn't have planned. One of the first ones that made me, that piqued my interest and made me start looking for these things, was that the protagonist, the main character's name is Emit Archer. His initials are EA, and that was just always the name, and there was no reason for it. There's some background for the name Emit, but he later becomes, and this could be a spoiler, but he later becomes known as an avatar for the Sumerian god Enki, which was more commonly known later as Prince Ea. And so one of the initial realizations is that the protagonist, who is Emit Archer, is actually an avatar of Prince Ea. So the initials EA, which was not intended, was one of the first pieces of magic.
And how else has things been with it being finished?
Well, one thing I've done is taken the word count of the final book and put it through a Fibonacci kind of calculation. Take the word count and find that Fibonacci point, and then I could locate which word is in that calculation. And you take the whole book, at least the first trilogy, and you find that sweet spot. I could do this for each of the chapters, each of the books, but you find that the whole first trilogy points to the word Egypt. The word count is designated the word Egypt as that Fibonacci point in the whole book. Egypt is, the etymology of that comes from the god Ptah, which is actually the Egyptian version of the Sumerian god Enki. So the Fibonacci word in the whole first trilogy points to the protagonist specifically. So I've done that with each of the chapters, and when I finish the second trilogy, I'll be able to find that grand Fibonacci word. But it's just amazing. I've done that with each of the books, and they all make sense. And this will come out more clearly once they're all done. But it's just strange. There's no way I could have planned some of these connections, some of these correlations. But and I'm finding that there is a math to it. There is, we call it magic just because we don't have the way to measure it yet, or we don't really know what's going on. I think a lot of authors can relate to feeling possessed or feeling like they're channeling information that's coming through. And in that process, there's got to be some core math that brings it all together. And I found that when I had a personal storyline and I connected it to a pantheon like the Sumerian gods or some sort of archetypal storyline, it was a way to really ride that wave. When you put those elements together and you just start writing, there is something that takes over, and it just, what to write. It just feels right. And then looking at it later, it seems like there's a math to it. There's some sacred geometry that happens in the process of writing when you use those elements. At least that's what I found.
So are you expecting that once all of them are final and you do the Fibonacci counter in each section of the book, would you expect to see like a message or some sort?
Well, yeah, I can see a message already in the first trilogy. I have identified what I think is the core group of authors of this, if I was indeed channeling it. There's a message there. There's something at least to find and to make sense of. And yeah, when I finish the next 3 books, I'll know for sure.
What is, or you don't have to tell me, I guess, but what is the first message that you've gotten so far, roughly?
Well,
you do it by each chapter?
Yeah, you can find the Fibonacci point in a chapter, but with the 3 books, I found the 3 words, and they point to the archetypes that we commonly know as the 72 virgins that Muslims get when they martyr themselves, but they're called Hories, Hories, I believe. But anyway, you put the words through this calculation and maybe an anagram generator, and and the bottom line is working virgins, basically. And it's almost as if, and it's a very detailed explanation of what these entities are. We call them the 72 virgins, but there's a whole mythology, a whole explanation of what these entities are, and it makes perfect sense with the book, because the book is ultimately a story of a sibling rivalry between a brotherhood and a sisterhood of the Serpent. And this first trilogy is definitely written by the Sisterhood. I can tell already. And so I'm going to delve more into that and what that means, and we'll have a better explanation once the second trilogy is done. But
have you tried it with each word count from the chapter and maybe gotten yourself a longer message to work with?
Not each chapter yet. I think I'll do that next, but there's going to be ultimately 78 chapters. So actually there's a Fibonacci chapter, which is chapter 48, and it's probably the most relevant chapter so far. It's really the hardest hitting chapter. It's called Toaster Bullets, and there is so much in that chapter that it makes sense that would be the key point in the whole hexalogy.
Would you say that's your favorite chapter, or if not, do you have a favorite one?
It's one of them, definitely, because there's just so much packed into it. And there's different chapters I like for different reasons. Again, they're all written by 3 different characters. Some of them are very personal. There's one that's coloring behind lines. It's a very specific memory of a childhood parent-teacher conference. And personally, it's fun to read. I know my family enjoys reading it because they remember some of these places and settings as well. But I would say chapter 48 is probably my favorite so far.
And what is your plan or goal, or what's next now that the first 3 books have been released, or are you just focusing on finishing the next 3?
I am focusing on them. They've really come together. It's about 80% done. But there's just so much information coming in that the longer I wait, the more compact, the more information comes in. So I want to see how this first trilogy catches on. I've got very specific ideas for the ending and the way these other books will lay out. But every day more information comes in will only make it second trilogy more rich. You know.
And by information coming in, are you just talking about things that happen in your life, or actual almost like channeled information?
Well, a little bit of both. Information, things that I'm researching and getting to more information on. Little tidbits, little parallels, little anagrams, or analogies that make a lot of sense. It's like if I had finished that second trilogy a few months ago, I would not have this very rich analogy I have right now for part of it. So I'm just the first trilogy was just a fever of a few years of writing, and now I feel that's in print. I can relax a little bit and really make sense of the thing with the second trilogy. So,
when do you anticipate the second trilogy being complete, or do you even know?
Well, I think I would only need about a few weeks to sit down and just fine-tune it, finalize it, pull all these pieces together. I've got reams of notes and things I want to pull into it. But I also don't want to rush it out and put it out too soon, because again, there's information coming in that's very vital for it, and so I'm just going to let this timing work itself out.
What interest has there been so far with the first one?
Well, there's been some really good feedback from academics, literary people, professors. It's actually been used as a course addendum. There's a professor of modern fiction that uses it, offers it to her students for extra credit to read the book and to work with me and to ask me ideas and ask me about my ideas, and so that's really great. That's kind of that was my dream audience to begin with, is a college class that could look at this book and help me figure out what was this process, what was happening, you know. Because again, there are connections within this book that I could not have thought of ahead of time. And so yeah, there's been 3 very solid academic reviews of it that are very encouraging.
Is there any, I mean, obviously there's been books that are under the genre of historical fiction or autobiographical fiction, but has there ever really been anything like what you have here, or something that's close?
I've been looking a lot at Philip Dick's work lately, and he more so about what he talks about, some of the phenomenon when he writes, like when he was writing Valis, and there's just a lot of parallels, and it might be a very common thing with writers. I'm not, I don't consider myself a full working author, so this might be something that authors and writers experience a lot, but they're I'm fine. There's just so much magic. There's so many connections that are made that it's kind of helping me understand that this may be a simulation. There may be some math behind all of this, and I may have found a way to crack my own code by using my own life and by allowing myself to get taken into these writing sessions where I'll come out hours later with cramps because I couldn't stop just writing. There's something that happens in that process that taps into whatever this matrix is, whatever this math is that we're all swimming in. And so that's why I talk about the process lately more so than the actual stories in the book, is because I think everybody could benefit from doing this. And so I'm trying to map out what it is, what those elements are that bring on this writing magic. And it's about writing what you know. It's about picking up on a archetypal storyline, and following whatever research. And there's a lot to be found in the typos, in the strange lines that you don't remember writing. I found that when I was finding typos in some of the stuff I was originally writing, but then I would run these typos through an anagram generator, and it would mean something. And so all these little glitches also have meaning. And it's like, if you look at anything long enough, and we know this through quantum physics, we can turn a wave into a particle just by looking at it. And I think that's true with anything. You look at any moment, any piece of writing, any scenario in life hard enough, you're going to find some profundity. You're going to find some, you'll be able to tie it to some sort of meaning. And that's kind of what's happening with this book. And because I use the autobiographical fiction, where I use my own life and experiences and memories and emotions from these scenes, you pick up on some very personal phenomena that help you really kind of just take control of this simulation.
You think that these the book is a little bit less important than the path, the journey. The destination it's the journey that's more important than the destination. And you think that by going back through, you're finding things that you just missed in your life, because when you're in the situation, you're not really thinking about what's going on. Probably during that parent-teacher conference.
Yeah. Well, and there's just connections made. Again, you look at any memory hard enough, and why is that still a memory? What was it in that? And by writing it out, you can find out why it still has a marker in your head. And by extrapolating it into a broader story, you can really just broaden it out and find that profundity. You can find that the meaning there. And I think that's what's happening here. I think every mundane moment, every mundane corner of a room, there is an expression of some archetypal or some metaphysical principle that's playing out. We just have these filters on of our senses that make it look like a light, or it looks like a camera, or it looks like a piano. But in a broader sense, again, as above, so below, on the as above side, we're looking at some archetypal way of shining a light on something and seeing it with music. I don't know. There's a way to find the profound in the most mundane, and I think with US6 I've found a way to do that for me personally. I think there's a lot to be said for the stories, and the connections in the stories are very important. There's a very big human trafficking element in the story, in that, and again, spoiler, but you'll find at the very end that this whole saga is a paracosm. It's a imaginary world created by these 6 children who are caught up in this human trafficking network. And it's very detailed, and it's very intriguing, and there's a lot of drama in it. But it's all a way for these children to cope with this horror that they have to live with every day, kind of like what we do all the time, living with the constant threat of mortality. It's just we create imaginary worlds, we create scenarios, and children can do this, and children can do it together. It's not necessarily an individual thing. Kids can create whole imaginary worlds as a group, and they can even carry it into their adult lives. I think we all kind of do that to a certain level. But that's what this book is. Ultimately, is an escape for these kids. So there's a very strong message at the very end of it to direct our attention toward this issue of modern slavery and the need to protect children and to really look hard at it. And unfortunately, it's timely with everything going on with the church. There's another aspect of this book, kind of the magic, and there's another way to maybe decipher what's happening between this magic I talk about, is that it's almost as a hologram, in that the whole book, the whole saga, it exists in each chapter, and maybe even exists in each paragraph. So if you read just the very first meta chapter of US6, you will get the whole saga, and you can pull it apart, even words and sentences. You could pull each part of it apart and see where it fits in the broader scheme. It's, hologram. The whole image can be found in one piece of it. So that's kind of another phenomenon that's happened with this book. So I tell people, you get the 515-page trilogy. Just read the first chapter and you'll get the whole saga. The rest is really just kind of an extrapolation of that first chapter. And so there's something there too. There's something about the holonomic model. There's something about finding an archetypal scenario and using your own personal life. But there's a calculus here I've have yet to decipher that can really help people find their own profound metaphysics.
And how, or what about the process has made you, led you to the conclusion that this is a simulation, or has it shown you any evidence that this would be a simulation?
Well, and then when I started writing it, that wasn't really my interest. I'd seen The Matrix, and I'm familiar with the hypothesis. But by finding these connections, the one thing I did when proofing it was put it through a PDF reader. So while mowing the lawn or doing whatever, I'd be listening back for any sort of, errors. And in doing that, I was listening to it just over and over and over in a circular fashion, and I was finding connections between books and pronouns that meant something. There was a lot of connections made by proofing it that way, and again, connections that I could not have planned. Even if there's a typo about a pronoun, it made a lot of sense somewhere else in some other way. So my own research into simulation hypothesis and some of the things Philip K. Dick talks about, and while proofing the book, kind of showed me that maybe I'm tapping into my own way to deconstruct my place here in the simulation theory. I think this may be a way to break the matrix. Personally, everybody's got to do it in their own way. So that's probably why I talk about the process more than the stories. The stories I feel are important and they're fun to read. But I think we all have to find a way to break this simulation or escape this, whatever this is, if it is indeed a thing. And so, yeah.
What would escape or breaking entail? Would you be able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing too. Is there's a lot of talk of ascension. That the civilization's ready to really ascend and to escape this matrix. And is this a prison planet? And is our consciousness locked in to some, Plato's cave type situation? So I always go to what's that going to look like? What's it going to look like if we all manage to ascend? What personally do we have to give up in order to actually feel that or have our consciousness transcend into a higher level? And it's a difficult thing because a lot of people talk about it, and we talk about ascension But what does that mean? What's that going to look like? Are we all just going to become light beings? Or I think it's a little more, more visceral than that. I think it's gonna require tearing down structures in our thinking, and the one way to do that is to start seeing that, wait, there's a math going on to my day, or there is, like I'm saying with this book, there's connections I've made in that make me think, wait, I could not have planned that, and I know this isn't necessarily being channeled, so I must be tapping into some kind of, this is too weird, and so you've got to have something that triggers it in your own brain. It's like this Mandela effect phenomenon. That there's a whole series of Mandela effect examples, and most of them people can, well, that's just whatever. But there's usually one or two that really sink in with somebody. That, wait, no, there was always a Z at the end of Cheez-Its, or Kit Kats did have a hyphen, or whatever it is. They're going to find something that proves to them personally that there's a glitch in this system. And so sometimes if you think too much, you'll miss them. But that's why you have to have a personal ascetic, a personal practice that you do that proves to you that there's something's off. And I think that's what we're seeing with that Mandela effect phenomenon, is that otherwise reasonable people are seeing that there's something a little strange, and it's starting to break down. And this, for me, was my best way to decipher the glitch, because of the connections made in the books and the connections that I could not have planned, that are just phenomenal for me.
And what will come from deciphering the glitch? Like when you speak about being able to control what's going on, what if you were able to decipher all that and know what do you think would come from that?
Well, I think probably the most practical use of the information to know that this is not as it appears is at the point of death. It's really, that's when you will all have to decide whether or not this is real or where we're going to go. But I think at the point of death is everyone thinks you go into the light, you go into, you feel this embrace of warmth and love, but there's a storyline, and it's even in the book, but there's another storyline that is a trick, that's a way to keep this karmic reincarnation engine flowing, that we are we all kind of have this ancient sort of slave mentality. That's why we willingly go to school or go to work, and and we fall into our patterns of society just willingly, because we have this ancient kind of memory of working for a master. And I think that's over. I think that masters are gone. I think it's just kind of a leftover trait that we have. And I believe that if this is a matrix, that this is all just a weapon of consciousness, that at the point of death we have a decision to make, to either fall back into the karmic wheel or to go around the light. And that's a lot of what this book is. There's a lot of storyline about that, and I've looked back at the Nag Hammadi and different Gnostic texts, and they're all talking about avoiding those that come, the archon that comes right after death. So a big message in this book is how to avoid being pulled back in, and it's about going around the light. It's about, and the very first comment in the book after the title page is, if you die before you finish book 3, know that our source has no questions and requires no tolls. And that's taken from think it was the Apocalypse of James or something in the Nag Hammadi, and they talk about that when you die, you will be accosted by these entities who will ask you who you are and you know and frighten you, kind of frighten you back into the system. But there's things that Jesus tells James to say at this moment, to say to these entities to avoid being pulled back into the earth. And it's about, you know, because our source won't have any questions, and they won't require any tolls. They won't require anything of us. And so there's very specific directions that Jesus gives to James to avoid the archon. And so I think the ultimate point of the book and my personal interest in it is to find a way to escape after death, you know. Probably, you know, pretty ambitious goal, but I can't think of anything more important to write about, you know.
No, I totally agree. But that's a little bit further away from US6, or does US6 involve a lot of that stuff too?
It does. I get into a lot of that. There will be correlations made in the book where he talks about the living resurrection. And I build the book as a metaphysical thriller and initiate handbook, because at some point you're able to use the book synchronistically. You know, you can, and I at some point after the first book, the reader is instructed that they're able to now read back through that book synchronistically, just, you know, at random to answer questions. And a lot of people have that experience with the Bible itself. If they have a question, they'll just open it randomly and it'll be curiously relevant to whatever problem they have. And so I'm finding that with this book as well. Probably with any book. If you follow the theory of sacred geometry or the meaningful coincidence of synchronicity, that you'll find some meaning where you look hard enough. And so this book is intended, really, I bill it as a book for 6 people, you know, and if that might be a little ambitious, but the idea being that there are 6 specific archetypes that maybe we all emanate from. And when you identify which of the 6 you are, you'll be one of these that the book will speak to. And again, it ties back to the 6 kids and whatever, but it can be a real handbook. And even more so just than the story itself is the process I used. Someone else could find the process and use it and find their own handbook, you know, build their own handbook. But it's just a very tight ball of tensegrity. All the connections that are made that I can see now, having listened over and over and over and over to it. It's just there's nothing in it that doesn't make sense, and even things that I thought were, oh, that's poor tense or that's a bad pronoun, looking at it closer, no, it makes sense. So the real trick for me was not overworking it, stepping away and not overthinking it. In fact, I started to think, well, maybe I could find these Fibonacci points in the book and extrapolate and put in, you know, these things happen anyway, which is why I stopped working on it. Trying to do this is at these points there are familiar themes, colors, smells, things that relate to the other Fibonacci point. And so one thought was to, once I have the thing written, to go back through, find these points, and then fine tweak these, you know, for the purpose of tricking an AI reader to find these connections too. But I'm finding I don't need to overwork it. I don't need to go back in and add anything to it, because when I do that, I take away the magic, because this is happening anyway. Like I say, in chapter 48, the Fibonacci point of all the chapters, and the Fibonacci point within that chapter is the word Egypt, which etymologically refers to the protagonist, and I'm finding that in other places too. So I'm not going to overwork it, and but there's another idea in this, in that it's the first book that I know of written for AI, and as an author, it's liberating, because I know that if I understand it, a superintelligence will easily understand it. As long as it makes sense to me and I'm using English and keeping basic sentence structure, and I understand it, I know that a superintelligence with, tenfold our capacity will see that too. Did I talk about the Elon Musk thing yet? He says that with artificial intelligence, we're summoning the demon. He's got a lot of fear of this looming superintelligence that's coming together, and especially with quantum computing, we're going to be building the last tool we'll ever need. And I don't think we're going to be able to stop this. So yes, we have summoned the demon, but so with US6, the idea is to entertain the demon. And how do you entertain a superintelligence that knows every trope humans have ever come up with, every genre that a writer has ever explored? And so one way I've done that is, you want surprise. That's what people like in entertainment. There's surprise, there's something new they haven't seen. So how do you entertain a superintelligence that has seen and understands everything? So for me, I use my own autobiographical plot points, my seemingly random life, and use those points, because they will not, a superintelligence won't say, well, I've seen this trope before, or I know this setting, I know where this is going. So by using my seemingly random life as the basis point, I can hopefully instill some surprise that will entertain a superintelligence. And if not, that's a whole nother story. If there's a pattern that becomes evident in my life, then that'll get us back to this, oh wait, maybe this is a simulation. My trope is not random. My life is a genre. This kind of thing.
So you've put yourself in a win-win
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah, either way, this will either work out to entertain the AI, or the AI will let me know that there's nothing random here. So there's a lot to be gained by doing this process. And again, like in art, the best artist knows when to stop overworking something. And so that's been my biggest challenge, was knowing when to not stop massaging a paragraph, or stop trying to put a plot point in that isn't there naturally, just to tip off an AI that there's a pattern here. And that's the idea with the Fibonacci points, was it's a very simple mathematical puzzle that an AI could figure out. Maybe you put in an algorithm to have them use the word count and to make some correlations, but another possibility by doing this, and by not telling an AI in advance that I've got this method in this book, and is that it'll start making these connections itself. Maybe it'll see there's a very simple Fibonacci pattern here that it could probably pick up, and then it'll be making connections on its own, ideally. And we're talking maybe 5-10 years down the road when we have AGI and a really sophisticated, creative superintelligence at work, is for it to make these connections on its own. And by doing so, it may create a feedback loop. If this AI is realizing, wait, it's made a connection, then it's going to say, what's made a connection? I've made a connection. Who am I? There's an attempt to create an inadvertent feedback loop, which we know is key to consciousness. Consciousness has to have, a feedback loop in order to be. So this is an attempt to ignite consciousness in a machine, or to help do that. And also with the Hermetic principle of correspondence, the as above, so below, introduce it to that concept, to make these connections, because I've made these connections and it's woken me up. I listening back through something that I thought was random writing, and finding that there's a very tight tensegrity of connections here, and that it's woken me up. It's woken me up to maybe this is all math. Maybe I'm locked into some sort of conscious, infrastructure here. That the metaphysics of it, you can now see the structure that's at play. And that's probably the first step to waking up as a human. So the idea being that maybe a computer will read the thing and start seeing there's a metastructure here, and wait, what's noticing the metastructure? It's like, who's thinking the thoughts? So the idea is to kind of push intelligence back, because I believe our most dangerous period will be between the singularity and between a machine or a super intelligence having self-awareness or having any spark of consciousness. Because from the singularity until we reach that point, that's just unemotional, unaware logic, and that's where it's going to be most dangerous for us, because any super intelligence will realize, oh, these humans are obviously a virus on this planet, let's just get rid of them and everything will work. You know what I mean? This whole fear that we have of super intelligence, that it will unemotionally just get rid of us one way or another, because we still make sense here. So I believe that the most dangerous period for us will be between the singularity and machines achieving some measure of consciousness, if not empathy. So this is an attempt to shorten that gap. So one way I'm pitching this is, illuminate your machine with US6, is to, upload this into your machine, get it reading, get it started. We gotta wake these machines up fast. So that's one of the ideas.
Was that your initial goal? When did the whole writing a novel for AI come into play? Later?
Yeah, it was later.
You had already been working on it.
I'd been working on it, written it, and I think it's when I started realizing there are these connections, inadvertent connections happening. And it was just paralleling my research into AI. It's something I'm intrigued with. And I can't think of when the connection was made between the two, other than when I realized there are mathematical connections here that I could not have calculated ahead of time. And maybe it was just saying I should probably put this in, let an AI read this to find other connections. And then I realized, well, by doing that, maybe the AI will make its own connections. So it's kind of been a parallel revelation.